And good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled Talking Ghosts and Bold Women, the Weird World of Spiritualism in the 19th Century. I'm joined tonight by Molly Worthen. She is an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Just as importantly, maybe more so, Professor Worthen was a fellow at the National Humanities Center in 2021. Today is September the 20th. Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. On behalf of the education team at the center, Meredith, Mike, and Raven, I want to thank you, as always, for spending some of your very precious personal evening time with us. We're always hopeful that our sessions are helpful and relevant in terms of the content that we share and the curriculum we may address. More importantly, though, I hope that you realize there's a whole nation full of dedicated educators who are also considering ways to make humanities education accessible and to give our students opportunities to see the value of the humanities. In particular, as I look around the room tonight, I'm excited to see so many new faces. Myra in Missouri, I think this might be one of your first webinars. Thank you so much for joining us. Andrea in Illinois, thank you for being here. Jennifer down at Walton High School in Georgia, always great to see you. Paige is here from Denver. Thank you for joining us tonight. Melanie is joining us from Maryland and Morgan State University. Mary, good to see you back at Rocky Hill High School in Connecticut. Also, Kathy at Kerr High School in Houston. Marcy, I don't think I've seen you join us before. Marcy's in Eastern Washington State. Joseph, you get the Far Out and Far Away award, as always. I think you likely will for some time. Joseph, I hope that you have your feet up, you're enjoying your coffee and your breakfast. Joseph is joining us from the Philippines tonight. And as always, we have a good group of Los Angeles teachers with us. Ben and Darlene, Jacaranda, thank you for joining us for the first time. Joel, you're in the SFB, and Abel, I noticed your name on the list primarily because you still have an AOL account. Wow, that's some past tense email address, and I appreciate, Abel, you joining us. I'm also pleased that the National Humanities Center is able to introduce you to scholars like Professor Worthen. One of the real joys, the pleasures I have in the work that I do at the center is being able to meet and get to know and spend time with just a fantastically interesting annual fellowship class. This year's group has been with us for a couple of weeks now, and I found myself at lunch today with 4 professors from different disciplines and different universities. In fact, at least 2 of them from different countries. And we were talking about, in kind of a fun, playful lunchtime way, we were talking about the ways that the humanities almost provides time travel. You know, tonight's opening question talked about mediums, and tonight's topic, of course, is about spiritualism. But we sort of pushed into this notion that the humanities gives us an opportunity to travel to faraway places we'll never go to visit time periods in the past that are long gone from the era that we live in currently, and in some ways channel their experiences, their memories, their thoughts, their emotions, their feelings, whether that's through literature or primary source, whether it's through material culture or art. You know, it's a way for us to empathize with others and the experiences they went through as we try to make sense of our own. And I think it's really helpful for me, at least, to think of the humanities that way. It's, in some ways, it's a chance to experience what others have experienced. And that sounds an awful lot like time travel or about medium and spiritualism, right? You're being able to channel these voices of the past. And maybe that's a topic that we'll push into tonight. Of course, all the work that we do and the material that we create is intended to be free and open for you, the education community. You can find all of the content that's created at the center, as well as contributions from nearly 100 other humanities organizations in the Humanities in Class digital library. That includes the readings and the viewings that each of our webinar leaders provides in advance. We hope these are helpful materials for you to not only review in advance of the live session, but also to go back afterwards and spend some time with reflecting and maybe pulling out some materials that seem particularly relevant for the students that you teach and the curriculum that you're responsible for. Our ultimate goal, and really the highest praise you could give the work that we do in these webinar series, is to translate it from scholarship to practice, from theory to instruction. and we hope to support you in doing that really in any way that we can. An advantage we have at the center is being, again, able to work with so many very talented humanists in the work that they do. It may be that you've gone through our webinar series and you scanned the 43 total sessions and seen set topics and seen different parts of the curriculum that you teach that you might be interested in. You also might choose to attend some of these because they do represent past National Humanities Center Fellows. For example, in just a few weeks, Vincent Brown from Harvard will join us. Vincent was a professor, is a professor of history at Harvard, and he was a fellow at the center in 2011 and 12. And he'll be working with us on his work, Tacky's Revolt, the story of the Atlantic Slave War. After the holidays, we'll be working with a variety of past fellows, including Juliana Barr, who was a fellow with us in 2018-19. Professor Barr is at Duke University, and we'll be talking about charting a path using maps and cartography to teach indigenous and native histories. A little later that month, we'll be joined by Mia Bay, professor of history from the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Bay was a fellow with us in 2009-10 and just won a major award for her work Traveling Black, Race and Resistance on the Road, Rails, and Skyways. And then closer to the end of our series, our season this year, one of Professor Worthen's colleagues at UNC Chapel Hill, Maggie Cow, will be joining us. Professor Cow is in the art history department and will be working with us on the ways that art can help us understand the past and present perspectives of U.S. imperialism. I do hope that you take a look through our entire season, sign up for those that you haven't, and maybe as importantly, share these with your colleagues and your departments and let them know the good time that we have on a regular basis. I'd also like to take a moment to announce a new online course. Of course, our online courses earn 35 professional development credit hours. They are designed to stretch over 6 weeks and require about 3 to 5 hours of work per week. The new course will be titled Journey to Equality, Examining the Promise, Reality, and Legacy of Reconstruction. So as a topic that is constantly evolving, the context of the world we live in, the contemporary understandings of the post-Civil War period, this might be a really helpful course for many of you who teach that portion of the U.S. History Survey. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome our Teacher Advisory Council to North Carolina tomorrow. They're all arriving by plane, train, and automobile at some point during the day tomorrow, and then we'll have 2 days at the center in retreat. I want to thank them in advance for not only their contributions throughout the year and so far during this year, but also for taking time out to leave their classrooms and develop subplans and come and join us here in the Triangle. Sometimes leaving your class and creating subplans requires more work than actually being there. And I'm very aware of the choices they made to be a part of the council, and I'm looking forward to working with each of them as the year progresses. Tonight's webinar does require, and we are expecting, that you're an active and chatty and irreverent bunch in the audience chat box. Please do share questions and thoughts and comments in the audience chat. You can also use, though, the Ask the Professor tab to submit formal questions. As the moderator, I'll be bringing these forward to Professor Worthen at different points where we take a break and we sort of answer questions and go through some clarifications. If at any point you've got a disruption in your signal, you can't hear well, things seem crackly, I would say that your first and probably your best solution will be to simply close your screen and log back in. It will not disrupt your documentation of attendance. It will also not disrupt us as we conduct the live event. So again, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for the Humanities in Class webinar titled Talking Ghosts and Bold Women, the Weird World of Spiritualism in the 19th Century. Our guest tonight is Molly Worthen. She's an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I also want to take a moment and thank Vicki Machado for joining us. Vicki is a member of our Teacher Advisory Council and will be tonight's TA. Vicki will be stirring things up in the audience chat. I see that she's already poking folks with different questions and comments, and she'll be developing some instructional connections over the next several weeks from tonight's talk. So, Professor, you're not so far from me here in Chapel Hill. How are you?
Great. Thanks so much, Andy. I'm excited to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I'm going to turn over the PowerPoint to you in a moment and ask you to guide us through this sort of mysterious world of spiritualism in the 19th century. But if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you a personal question just between us, just not the 300 some people in the room right now, but just between us. Professor, have you gone to a medium?
I never have. I would love to. My hero is the great philosopher William James, who always valued staying completely open to all forms of evidence, supernatural or material. And I try to live by that, but I have not personally done so.
I wonder, and of course, we asked this question at the beginning. A lot of folks are sharing some fun and reflective comments on this, but I find myself wondering, where you would find a medium. And I don't mean literally, because, quite literally, you could probably go to the internet or the newspaper, or you talk to someone, or you go to, one of the cocktail bars that are doing this kind of for fun in the corner. But I'm talking about like a real one. I wonder, where do you find mediums today, I wonder? And do you use like Yelp reviews? And are there some that have better qualifications than others? I'm not sure.
Well, I don't think they are as hard to find as you're suggesting. And towards the end of my talk, I'll say a little bit about some of the modern day descendants of the people I'll be focusing on.
That's lovely. So that actually be a really nice punchline at the end, and I think we're looking forward to that. But well, thank you. And it's one of those in some ways I think my question was not intended to be playful as much as to say that that I'm going to be anxious to see if the conversation around mediums and spiritualism is literal and metaphoric, or where we can find the parallels. And I think the audience is going to look for some of those connections as well tonight. I'm the moderator. I'm going to be bringing questions to you on occasion, but you've got full control of the PowerPoint, and thank you again for being here.
All right, terrific. Well, I'm thrilled to be here. Today, my topic is ghosts, but it's also the history of science, the feminist movement, religious authority, a few other things. I really love talking about the spiritualist movement and teaching this because it quickly gets us into so many other topics. I think when you first start to read about it, spiritualism seems like a kind of weird, marginal historical footnote, but it is really not at all. And I think if you teach young people for a living, as I think most of us do, you're always looking for hooks to get them interested in history. And spiritualism is definitely that. In teaching the history of spiritualism, it basically involves telling a bunch of ghost stories. So what's more fun than that? I'm going to try to answer or at least poke at two giant questions in my talk tonight. The first is, how did Americans and Europeans think about invisible forces in the late 18th and 19th centuries? And second, I'm interested in what their ideas can tell us about the ongoing debate in this time period and in our own about how humans can know the hidden secrets of the universe, really. What is the right method for investigating those secrets? What counts as evidence? What is even possible for us to know? So that's kind of our big picture agenda. Now, before I get to the ghost stories, I want to explore this question of invisible forces from another angle. I'm going to talk about magnetism, but from maybe a slightly unusual approach. We typically think of magnetism in, a pretty narrow sphere, something that physicists study. Magnets have this quite utilitarian role in our everyday lives. You've got magnets on your fridge, that kind of thing. But for a long time, people viewed magnets with really a metaphysical fascination, a sense that they can be a window into this invisible force that can give humans great power if we learn to master it. One really old idea was that magnets can heal the sick. The ancient Aztecs, Egyptians, Chinese all used natural rock magnets for various therapeutic purposes. Then in the 16th century, this guy, whose image you see now, Paracelsus, who was, I guess you would call him an alchemist slash physician slash theologian. He was Swiss. This is a time when these disciplinary categories are really fuzzy. He taught that magnets can draw diseases out of the just as they attract pieces of iron. So, the point is that there's this interesting idea of magnetism as a powerful force that can be harnessed for therapeutic purposes, and a number of different cultures have traditions of exploring that. Okay, so fast forward to the 1780s, when we see this interest in magnetic healing in the West really explode. And it's all due to this guy, this Austrian doctor named Franz Anton Mesmer, who really made waves in Paris with new methods for treating diseases. Now, he played on some old ideas. He borrowed from Paracelsus. He also picked up an ancient Greek idea of a so-called animal spirit produced by the brain. And Mesmer claimed that he could manipulate an invisible magnetic fluid that he said passed between and within all bodies in the universe. And he called this phenomenon animal magnetism, as opposed to the mineral magnetism of iron and lodestones. So animal magnetism was, on the one hand, a scientific theory. It was an idea about magnetic force. But it was also a medical theory about illness and treatment. Now, Mesmer's patients were often women, and they would come to him suffering from everything from a toothache to vague weakness without really a clear cause, to seizures, what we might now diagnose as epilepsy. And Mesmer's aim was not so much to eliminate symptoms, but to elicit them in a controlled way in order to study them and eventually kind of rein them in and control them. And you'll see the same pattern if you leap forward a bit more than a century later in Sigmund Freud's pioneering work in psychoanalysis. Freud would also take on these young women exhibiting symptoms that baffled doctors, that often did not seem to have a physical origin. And Freud used hypnosis, free associations, other methods to try to draw out the subconscious cause, which he believed was often some kind of repressed trauma. So again, we see this idea of a kind of invisible force that is controlling us against our will. And because of these later echoes in Freud, some historians see Mesmer and mesmerism as basically an early form of psychiatry. So what did he actually do? What was it like to be treated by Mesmer? He usually worked by sitting across from the patient. He would pinch the patient's knees between his own knees, and he would run his fingers over the person's body. He was trying to establish what he called rapport by connecting with magnetic powers, particularly through the fingers, through the person's nose. But that was just one method. He had this other approach that I think is so interesting, which you see depicted in these images here. Sometimes he arranged his subjects in a circle around these bathtubs, and they'd be filled with iron filings and bottles of mesmerized water. That is water that he had treated. And so he sort of activated the animal magnetism in the water. And he would sometimes be nearby and encourage the flow of magnetic fluid by playing the glass harmonica. That's this kind of interesting instrument, I think invented by Ben Franklin, of different glass shapes, or sometimes bowls, that you create different tones by rubbing the top and that sort of thing. He was interested in the way that music can echo and even intervene in the fundamental patterns and forces of the universe. In some ways, Mesmer's mindset, it kind of harks back to really a medieval way of learning about the world, what medieval scientists called natural philosophy. That is a worldview in which everything is interconnected, when you don't have these disciplinary boundaries, between music and physical science and health sciences, where it makes sense to study these things at the same time. So what happened to patients in these situations? Well, all kinds of things. Some patients fell asleep And when they woke up, they claimed they had spoken with spirits of the dead. You see here an image of a magnetic trance. This sort of magnetic sleep that this woman in the image appears to be in, it was supposed to free the patient from her physical body, maybe allow her to travel through time. Sometimes being in this state would bring up repressed traumatic memories. Mesmer, he didn't go into this work with a super clear, developed idea of everything that might happen or that he and his patients could expect. In part, his patients were having these reactions, reporting these experiences, and he was responding to them. He was assimilating their experiences into his theory of animal magnetism. And he really liked what his patients were reporting. He announced that clairvoyant abilities, telepathy, often came with this sleeping state. And if patients had the right rapport with their magnetizer, the right relationship, they could even see inside bodies, including inside their own body, and potentially diagnose their own disease. Other patients responded more dramatically. Sometimes one might collapse, rolling around on the floor. Mesmer sometimes had to call in his mesmerist valet named Antoine, who would carry the patient into kind of a crisis room to recover. And then on the other hand, there were patients who didn't respond at all. And Mesmer, in that case, he might get really close to you. He might be dressed in his favorite lilac taffeta robe. And he would claim to pass magnetic fluid into you with his hands by staring at you with a very intense gaze, maybe even waving over you his special mesmerized wand. Okay, now it won't surprise you that stories of this horrified the medical establishment, amused cartoonists who sketched charlatans, putting helpless women to sleep, their eyes full of predatory intentions, pockets bulging with fees, that kind of thing. Here's an image, a late 19th century reprint that shows all these demonic figures hovering around one of Mesmer's bathtubs, showing how people were nervous about perhaps the relationship this might have to the occult, to evil powers. King Louis XVI of France became quite alarmed at these stories. He convened a royal commission to investigate Mesmer's claims. This is in 1784. This commission was serious. It included 5 members of the Royal Academy of Sciences, including the great chemist Lavoisier. It included Benjamin Franklin, who was at this time serving as a diplomat in France. The commission took their task pretty seriously. They tested Mesmer's patients. They underwent treatments themselves. Their verdict was not surprising. They concluded that in cases where people were responding to mesmerism, it was a matter of mental suggestion. It was not some mysterious force. Mesmer's claims about this fluid, moving through invisibly all creatures, this was nonsense. But here's what is so interesting. Okay, you have the commission issuing this verdict, right? You have a pretty hostile medical establishment who want to disown Mesmer. He had a physician's training himself, but he was by no means a mainstream doctor. You've got pamphlets going around, listing all these experts who say this guy's a fraud, don't believe him. Mesmer's ideas continued to gain converts. When I teach this material to students, at this point, I like to ask, should we be surprised by this? How much do assertions coming from experts affect what people choose to believe in our own time? And I think this is a really interesting opportunity to get them thinking about intellectual authority, how we decide who counts as an expert, whether we can trust them, how many Americans disagree on these questions right now. Now, in the years immediately before the French Revolution, many of Mesmer's disciples actually embraced animal magnetism, embraced his practices, precisely because the establishment opposed it. They kind of liked the fact that their teacher snubbed elite authority. Now, he did cater to plenty of aristocratic patients. They were the ones with some money, right? He wasn't some kind of populist. But his basic message was, okay, come try it out, make up your own mind for yourself. Use the authority of your own senses. Maybe at this point I can stop and ask if there are any questions, Andy, that we should consider.
As a matter of fact, there are some questions coming in. Thank you. This first question actually goes back to something you mentioned a little earlier. It comes in from Sundina, who is joining us tonight from Los Angeles. And the question is addressed to you. You mentioned that Southern spiritualists identified as Christians more than Northern spiritualists and tended to focus only on communication with the dead. Why weren't they as concerned about reform movements?
That's interesting. I'm not. Is the question? Maybe it's coming from the reading. Well, I'm going to get to politics later on in just a few moments, because
okay.
The short answer is that many spiritualists were deeply concerned with politics, and one reason why in recent decades historians have kind of taken a new look at them and taken them more seriously is precisely because even if you not inherently interested in different theories of the supernatural, this is a movement with serious political implications. But I'll get to that in a few minutes.
Yeah, absolutely, we will. This question comes from a comment that I saw. I believe the comment was from Vicky, our TA tonight, who is joining us from Winter Park, Florida. And she noticed that that water was an important part of healing, particularly at this point in this part of the story. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the role of water in the story?
Gosh, well, I think it was a natural connection for Mesmer to make. Water as a medium that was so versatile and familiar, and yet could change forms so easily, and be said to contain powers without necessarily demanding any physical evidence. I think there's sort of this long, complicated prehistory in so many different religious traditions of water having power, of water having a sacramental role in Christianity, in the rite of baptism, and water having this role in purification in Hindu culture and many indigenous cultures. You could go on. So there's this kind of almost instinctive relationship, I think, that humans have with water. In the particular context of Mesmer's work, he simply had this theory that he could kind of activate the power of water, and people wouldn't bathe in it. It's not intuitive for us, but they would be connected to these large bathtubs full of mesmerized activated water and iron filings. And the action happens sort of off stage, as you will. I mean, the action is, you have to trust Mesmer, and it is in the exchange of this invisible fluid, not in the water that you see. The water is this conduit that provides this role, but it is not the thing you're to be watching. It's not like you're sitting around a cauldron, waiting for it to bubble over and show you evidence that energy of some kind is happening there. So much of this is premised on trust and people's trust in Mesmer's narrative of what was happening.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Thank you. And again, this may be something that you're going to get into a little bit more later on, but I do want to bring this question from Trevor. Trevor's joining us from the Bay Area, California, Northern California, and he's wondering how you might add the lens of race to the conversation so far. We're talking a lot about gender. How does this break down across racial lines or divides?
I will get to that a little bit in the future. I've been focused right now on animal magnetism because it's this crucial backstory to the spiritualist movement. But certainly, when we get to the spiritualist movement, we can talk more about race. I would say the story I'm telling you now. This is initially it's a European story. To the extent that we can impose our racial categories on it now, it's a white story. But certainly it connects later on with various traditions. Especially in New Orleans and that area, and traditions that kind of come up through the Caribbean and get to the southern United States and a little bit later, urban centers further north that connect primarily African American, Afro-Caribbean ideas about the spirit world and connecting with the spirit world to this more European originated tradition. But that's a bit later than this backstory I'm giving you right now.
Great. Well, let's move a little further into the story then, and we've got some more questions that may open those different perspectives up. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think I left off by saying that in a certain way, Mesmer is sending this pretty democratic message. He's saying, try this thing out. Trust what your senses tell you. Mesmerism certainly continued to have very elite followers. For instance, there's this great German romantic writer whose pen name was Novalis, who was really interested in mesmerism and experimented with these techniques with his own family members. And you see, if you look at a number of these romantic philosophers in Europe and particularly German-speaking lands, the ideas of animal magnetism really appealed to many of them. They had some similar ideas. They had an idea of kind of an absolute spirit that manifests in nature and in our bodies, and it's there whether we're healthy or sick, sort of echoing the force of animal magnetism. And so, I mentioned that simply to make the point that, there's this way in which Mesmer's ideas intersect with broader speculations and broader trends in European intellectual life. By, say, the 1820s, you see several different schools of magnetism with different theories. You have some mesmerists who believe in the laying on of hands to channel this force, or the laying on of magnets in order to transmit what they called healthy animal fluid to the patient. And you have a kind of growing economy of, really entertainment based on these practices. I'm showing you here a poster from 1842 from the United Kingdom, and I've got to read it. It's just so interesting. A full discovery of the strange practices of Dr. Elliotson on the bodies of his female patients at his house in Conduit Street, Hanover Square, with all the secret experiments he makes upon them and the curious postures they are put into while sitting or standing, when awake or asleep. And you have this picture with a female patient being blindfolded to undergo an operation. We're not sure what that is. The whole as seen by an eyewitness and now fully divulged. So you can see that there's something scandalous, in these practices, something tittillating. There's the sort of erotic tension of a relatively helpless woman being put under this, unknown power. There's a lot going on here. I also want to talk about a really important broader piece of the religious context. You see here a classic image from the revivals that were sweeping North America, to some extent the United Kingdom, in these years of the early 19th century. So we're talking about the Second Great Awakening. And when I'm teaching mesmerism and spiritualism, I really try to emphasize these connections to the broader American religious context. Because at these evangelical revivals, there was a different kind of experience with invisible forces acting on people, making them seem to lose control. Now, for believers, this was the Holy Spirit, compelling people to fall to the ground, bark like dogs, writhe around, all kinds of crazy stuff. Critics of these revivals, which included plenty of Christians who were just kind of dubious about these displays of enthusiasm, these critics sometimes blamed animal magnetism. They said the evangelist must be some kind of demonic magnetizer to elicit this kind of behavior. There were also traveling doctors who pitched their services in mesmerism to factory owners who needed help managing their workforce, their largely female workforce, I should add. So as I'm talking about these different cultural factors, my broader point is that the theory of animal magnetism landed in America at just the right time, when older religious authorities were losing their grip a little bit, and Americans were kind of used to a lot of self-proclaimed prophets and healers running around, people starting their own religions. I mean, this is the time when the Mormon church is getting started. So, we can think of these doctors and traveling showmen as magnetic evangelists, in a sense, proselytizing on behalf of really if not an alternative deity, then at least a kind of pervasive, invisible force that, ruled the world unseen. I mean, it really almost a kind of surrogate God. Are there any questions at this point before I go on to this question of did people actually believe all this stuff, which is where I want to go next?
Yeah, there is one question. This comes from Carolyn. Carolyn is the epitome of a lifelong learner. She's a retired public school educator who joins us regularly in New Hampshire. And she's wondering, and this may be a good time for this question, if there were certain pockets of the country that that this seemed to thrive and take root more than others. What's the geography of this period of time that, as you described it, is just the right time?
That's interesting. If we're talking about where there are places where these kind of traveling magnetizers got traction, I think that's hard to answer. I mean, certainly they often prioritized urban areas. Those who were interested in selling their services to factory owners would sensibly be attracted to urban industrial centers. But the nature of the early as railroads are starting to make longer journeys easier, and as we're kind of entering the age of the Lyceum movement, traveling speakers and traveling salesmen, that becomes really a career with broader reach in a way that it didn't have before. I think it's very hard to put clear boundaries on this. And we can talk later on, maybe in further Q&A, about some of the regional differences as we move into the spiritualist movement. But this is a broad phenomenon.
Great, absolutely. And again, I think folks are trying to, I can sense from the audience, everyone's trying to put their fingers on, sort of the mysterious side of the story and how to grab onto it. This next question comes from Kathy in Frederick, Maryland, and it's similar to the geography in the sense that she's wondering how communications technology affected or impacted the spread, the growth, the success of spiritualism in the 19th century.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, certainly people's fascination with the telegraph and some of this really quite brand new technology emphasizes the power of these invisible forces, electricity, magnetism, that people do not understand. I mean, I would argue even in our own time, the vast majority of us don't know how our phones work, but it's starting to have a presence in everyday life. And yet, what is this, right? Like, what is this force that has this really kind of magic power? And it's not fully understood. And I'll say a little bit more about this as we move into this question of belief. It's not fully understood at this point, even by professionally trained experts. So it's a hugely exciting but also a kind of terrifying area.
Yeah, absolutely. Last question before we move on. This comes from Michelle. Michelle is in nearby Durham at the North Carolina School of Science and Math. And she's wondering if there are ties at all to Eastern religion or medical traditions. She notes, for example, that the Transcendentalists were influenced, especially Emerson. What kind of connection is there with Eastern religion?
There are some. You guys are so on top of it. You are like always one step ahead of me. So I'll try to pull some of these threads out of the broader context as I really get into spiritualism. So let me put that question just to one side for a moment.
That sounds good. Okay, you go forward, and then we'll continue to pull these questions to you.
Great. Well, so one point I always want to make to students is I think it is so tempting when we study any era, more than 30 years prior to our own time, really, to be kind of condescending, to think, well, gosh, we just know so much more than people did back then. They didn't have the modern technology and medicine and the internet. They couldn't, Wikipedia things. I think this is a real temptation for our students that if you're teaching history, you constantly have to fight against what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery and really get into the worldview of the people you're studying and confront the fact that, we know from evolutionary biology that the chemistry of our brains as humans has not changed that much in thousands of years. We have the same equipment, so we shouldn't condescend. So I'm interested in this question of credulity, right? Like, what did people really believe when they would go to these demonstrations by so-called experts in animal magnetism? People back then were not fools. Even people who were intrigued by the claims of mesmerists were constantly on the lookout for hustlers. And some audiences detected them immediately. I've spent some time going through newspaper accounts of traveling mesmerists for a book I'm working on, and I ran across a really interesting article about a certain Dr. Adrian and a young assistant who attempted to fool an audience in Vermont in 1842. A jury of lay observers had come together at his demonstration. So these are people, who just turned up, bought a ticket, and were selected by their peers to really kind of grill him. And they immediately discovered that Adrian's assistant was not mesmerized, was not in any kind of trance. He was wide awake, ready to kind of play along. Adrian immediately shut down the performance, but that did not stop the crowd. You can imagine they're pretty angry at this point, from yanking up the carpet and uncovering an elaborate rig of strings and pulleys that was going to carry out, the planned illusions. It's not really clear what this guy had in mind. Like he was probably going to make his assistant seem to levitate, that kind of thing. Okay, so the audience is furious. They demand their refund. They get their money back. But even still, they refuse to let the guy go until he and his assistants signed a written statement admitting that they lacked, and this is what the confession said, they lacked the power of producing the promised effect, and they had utterly failed in the attempt to fool the audience. The reporter said that this audience was determined not to be humbugged. That was his language. What I find really interesting is that this confession, it's pretty humiliating for the guy. It did not deny that the phenomenon of animal magnetism existed. We have to remember that this is still about 20 years before the great Scottish scientist James Clerk Maxwell starts to publish his series of really influential papers saying that electricity and magnetism are two related phenomena that we should talk about as electromagnetism. The big insight that electricity and magnetism are both travel through space as waves, that a magnetic field produces an electric current and vice versa. So these forces, in the 1840s, these are still quite mysterious, even to experts, and they would remain mysterious to lay people long after Maxwell. So this committee simply declared that this particular trickster had not mastered the magical power of magnetism. People still wanted to believe that this force was out there, just this particular guy was a fraud. It wasn't that the whole thing was nonsense. I think we have to imagine these scenes playing out in an American culture where one of the main ways people with any pocket money would seek entertainment was to hear a visiting lecturer, really across all genres, not just science, but literature, politics, theology, you name it. Through the 1830s and 1840s and beyond. I mean, Ralph Waldo Emerson really hits his stride in this lecture circuit in the 1850s. These lecturers toured the country, and these guys who were specialists in magnetism, and they would promise lessons and live experiments in magnetism and electricity. I've run across newspaper advertisements for demonstrations of these forces. And one guy put in his ad that he wouldn't just show the audience magnets moving iron and setting machines in motion, but he would also explain what he called the system of the universe, capital S, capital U, including, this is his language, the higher laws of moral, intellectual, and divine science, all for 25 cents. But this is so interesting, right? The grandeur of his claims. And well into the 20th century, this is an industry promising really the high and the low, promising you answers to existential questions, what moves the universe, but also, look at some of these ads, magnets as solutions for thinning hair and, illness and weight loss. I think these are such interesting samples of people's thought of this new, poorly understood technology. We have this electromagnetic hairbrush and comb, which is going to give you lustrous, glossy hair. This magnetic corset, which promises to cure, look at this list: sleeplessness, nervousness, general debility, indigestion, rheumatism, and paralysis. The effect being exhilarating to the wearer. Maybe my favorite is this image on the left here, or the right, the magneto-conservative garments. It's like this body suit that makes all kinds of claims, promises a full cure to dropsy, that is edema, water retention. So we have this whole range of highfalutin metaphysical claims and kind of, snake oil cures what ails you, traveling salesman approach to magnetism. Now I'm going to turn to spiritualism. But before I go to spiritualism, are there any questions about this kind of backstory of animal magnetism?
There's a lot of great conversation happening in the audience chat. Vicki, I want to thank you for keeping things going. It seems like the one comment that you made that might have the most traction when folks leave is this term chronological snobbery. That's really awesome.
I'm a big believer that it's one of the main missions of any of us who teach history to fight against that.
Certainly. Well, let's keep moving, and then we'll queue some questions up a little bit further along.
Yeah. All right. So ghosts. Now, if you lived in Pittsburgh or Buffalo or New York City in the mid-19th century, you weren't really in the mood for a magnetic demonstration. You might go instead to another kind of performance that was really popular at this time. You could attend a seance, trying to communicate with ghosts, or hear a trance speaker. These encounters with the supernatural were part of what we call the Spiritualist movement, which was an enormous cultural phenomenon with connections to mesmerism. You'll remember that I said that some followers of mesmerism believed it could give you the power to talk to the spirit world. Spiritualism, if we want a just quick and dirty definition, is the belief that the living can communicate with the spirits of the dead. Now, that basic idea, it has antecedents going back many centuries in various different cultures. It's still a view that exists today. But if you had a chance to read the excerpt from the book by Anne Browdy that I circulated, you read about the origins of this as a 19th century movement. And she lays out how it began in upstate New York in 1848, when these teenage girls, Kate and Margaret Fox, shown here with their older sister Leah, started hearing strange knocking noises on the walls and floor of their family's house. And these noises would only occur when they were present. And they claimed that these knocks came from the spirit of a dead peddler who was buried in the basement. Neighbors got very curious about these reports, especially when the sisters said that you could ask the spirit questions and he would answer back in kind of a coded series of knocks. The Fox girl's older sister, Leah Fox, after she was married, Leah Fish, she discovered that she had the gift to channel spirits. And this happened after one of their local supporters had magnetized her. So there we have another one of these kind of concrete connections between mesmerism and this early spiritualist movement. Now, what is the right way to think about spiritualism? I think sometimes it looks to us like a religious movement. Some spiritualists gathered for worship on Sundays, sang hymns. They had theological views. They often believed that Christ was not divine. He was just a really good spiritualist. That's why he was able to, perform exorcisms and so forth. Spiritualists generally, they took a much more optimistic view of human nature compared to traditional Christianity. They rejected the idea of original sin inherited from Adam and Eve. They tended to teach that all humans are born good. You don't need to be saved to live eternal life as a spirit. That's the destiny for all of us. So for some people, this is like a super serious religious commitment. And in fact, later on, we'll even see the spiritualist churches, calling themselves churches form. But some people interacted with spiritualism much more as a hobby, kind of getting your friends together for a seance, maybe playing with a planchette, also called a Ouija board. Here is an image of a seance and, some of the wild things that were said to happen. So it's not just that the medium would claim to channel the voice of a dead person, but they, would have, furniture levitate. There was one medium I read about who specialized in making his accordion play, like without anyone touching it. That was his signature move. But of course, the main thing that people wanted when they showed up at these things was to hear from dead loved ones. With the help of this human medium who claimed to channel their voices. I mean, this is an era, and here again, I always, it's like one of these obvious points perhaps about the 19th century, but whenever you're teaching it, I think it is so important to just drill down on it and remind students that death was a much more imminent presence in people's lives than we have the privilege of imagining today. I mean, infant mortality rates were so high. Just in any line of work you might name, common illnesses that our students today tend to view as something that maybe you have to go get an antibiotic and it barely keeps you out of school could be a death sentence. This is one of these basic facts that is just really important to keep at the front of your brain when you're thinking about spiritualists. So, mediums would often claim to relay the advice from your deceased parents. A big area of demand among their clients was to seek some kind of message from dead children. So many children died in infancy or early childhood, and parents were just desperate for some reassurance that their children were happy. Sometimes people would come to these seances seeking the wisdom of dead statesmen. Apparently, Ben Franklin was a really popular guest at seances, partly because spiritualists believed that his experiments with electricity kind of presaged their own communications. And I think this is an interesting point to dwell on because it shows us how a lot of these spiritualists viewed their work as really a kind of pioneering science, not just a kind of dabbling in magic or the supernatural, but really a kind of science based on natural laws. And you see this, someone earlier raised the question of connections to Eastern traditions. A little bit later than this, like 1870s, we start to see the rise of the Theosophy movement. And, we have this kind of fascinating Ukrainian aristocrat, emigre, Madame Helene Blavatsky, who travels the East and picks up these ideas from her kind of, very imperfect knowledge of Hinduism and Buddhism and mashes it all together with some of her colleagues into a kind of, Eastern view of transmigration of souls and reincarnation. But very much, she was pitching it as a science. Like this, you think you've been studying evolution or, whatever you think is the cutting edge of science. No, to really be on the cutting edge of science, you have to be connecting the natural and the supernatural. You have to be pulling the threads of wisdom from these different civilizations and really combining them to be on the cutting edge of progress and understanding the laws, the hidden laws that really govern our passage through the universe. Now, before I move on to the gender aspects of this and talk specifically about how this is a women's movement, are there any questions?
Yes, we do have some questions. This first question comes from Mike. Mike is in Pennsylvania, and he notes that earlier you mentioned 3 cities, including Pittsburgh, where people would go to seances instead of magnetism performances. What was different in these cities that made people seek different performances?
Oh, gosh, I didn't mean to suggest that those cities were places where specifically people would definitely prefer one over the other because of cultural reasons, but rather that in the mid-19th century, those are examples of cities that were large enough where, if you go back and look at the newspaper record, which I've spent some time doing, you find this kind of spectrum. You find, these options ranging from seances to more what we would now see as kind of scientific demonstrations. So I kind of pulled those cities out of a hat as an example of the scale of community that would support a really rich range of this kind of entertainment.
Fantastic. And actually, Mike has a follow-up question that is appropriate here, given that you just mentioned the newspaper articles. He's noticed that he noted that he's looked all over for newspaper accounts of the Fox sisters visiting Pittsburgh, and he can't find anything. Professor, do you have any recommendations of where he can find these kinds of archives?
That's interesting. I don't offhand know. I mean, the Fox sisters traveled an awful lot. I'm not 100% certain whether they got to Pittsburgh. I, in my own research, have relied very heavily on ProQuest historical newspapers, which I think is the largest database. And it's national with some international coverage, and it goes back to different degrees depending on the publication. Early American newspapers is another database I've used that's much better for the earlier piece of the story I'm telling. Although the media is simply spottier then. You don't get the really rich textual evidence and all of these elaborate advertisements across these different genres until we get into the 19th century. But those are the databases I rely on the most. And, the best ones are those that offer full-page scans so that you end up stumbling on, not just the articles, the things that the text recognition picks up, but you also see some of these advertisements that don't always show up when you're doing keyword searches. So those are the databases that I've used most in my own research.
Great, thank you. One more question before we move on. We've got about a little under 30 minutes in tonight's webinar. This question comes from Tanya. Tanya is in Boston, and Tanya, gosh, I'm sorry, one moment, Professor, I just misplaced that question. I had it jotted down on the side. Gosh, I apologize. I jotted it down and it scrolled out of sight. If I can find it, I'll bring it back to you, but why don't we move on for now?
Okay, sounds good. I want to talk now about the experience of women. I think the reading, the excerpt from the Anne Browdy book, begins to give us a sense of the appeal of spiritualism for some women. In the 19th century, while all people had death in their face all the time, I think you could make the argument that women in particular had a pretty intimate experience with death, particularly the death of infants and small children. Of course, anytime they got pregnant, they had to face the possibility that they would not survive. But because of the rate of infant mortality, I mean, the idea that you could communicate with your dead child from beyond the grave was of incredible comfort. And, again, like there's this temptation when we're learning about the spiritualists and we're dwelling on some of the goofier aspects of seances, I think can be tempting to kind of make fun of our subjects here. But I think it's important, on the one hand, when you're teaching this material, it's appropriate sometimes to kind of lean into the entertaining aspects of this, but it's also important to really stress to students the incredible grief that people lived with. I mean, this idea that just because back then children died, commonly before age 5 and people had more children, to suggest that means that parents were not as attached to their children is complete nonsense. I mean, if you begin to read the accounts that parents write on the occasion of their children's death, that idea that they grieve their children any less than we do now is falls apart. So, the idea that you could communicate with a child that had died before his or her time from beyond the grave was really of incredible comfort. The other point I think is useful to stress is that in our own time, we tend to associate death and serious illness with hospitals, nursing homes. But in this period, in the 19th century, most people died at home. They died surrounded by female relatives. Death was very much women's work. The other piece of this is that the spiritualist movement played on Victorian ideas about femininity. Women were thought to be more passive, prone to suggestion, so a spirit could easily take over a woman's mind and voice. Men were generally thought to be too rational, aggressive. This might block the spirit from entering the person. So following that logic, the best mediums, supposedly, were young girls. And their youth, their inexperience, their lack of education, all of these were considered advantages. I am really interested in this class of mediums known as trance speakers, who gave public lectures in a state of hypnosis as a spirit controlled them. You read an article that I circulated ahead of time about a woman named Cora Scott. She's sometimes referred to as Cora Hatch. You see her here. Hatch was one of her married names. She was married 4 times. She was the most famous trance speaker in America. She began her career at age 11. So let me just tell you a little bit about her. She's super fascinating. I mean, I think given the age of most of your students, I mean, here is a subject that they can potentially really connect with. Cora Scott was born in 1840 in western New York State. She was born with a caul, meaning the amniotic sac covered her head as a newborn, which was traditionally seen as a sign that God had chosen this baby for important things. When she was in grade school, spirits supposedly moved her hand to help her complete a school essay in their own words. So this is something she's dabbling in, at a quite young age. Later on, her family moved to Wisconsin, and neighbors started to seek out Cora's medical guidance. They believed that this schoolgirl, I mean, she's in elementary school, that she could diagnose diseases while in a trance by channeling the spirit of a German doctor. Now, she really hits her stride as a teenager, and she became famous for being able to enter a lecture hall in a trance and then deliver a lecture on any topic the audience chose, like spontaneously. Journalists loved her. She made great copy, They always commented on how beautiful and innocent she looked, these beautiful blonde ringlets she's got. You can kind of see that in the picture. The idea that a teenage girl could give a lecture to hundreds of people, I mean, this was so crazy at the time that the audience was often, inclined to believe that she was actually possessed by a spirit. I mean, this was a time when very few Americans believed that women to speak publicly before a crowd of, a co-ed crowd, and yet trance speakers addressed hundreds or thousands of listeners at a time. This was a time when it was pretty scandalous for a single woman to travel by herself, but these women had kind of social permission to travel alone between their gigs. Historians think that at least 200 women made their living this way. So, we're not talking about like thousands and thousands, but it's not insignificant. When Cora Scott was still a teenager, she moved to New York City and married a man named Vincent Hatch, who was a pretty domineering guy. He was about 30 years older than her, and he became her manager. All this time, the crowds coming to her events are getting larger. She's charging more and more in speaking fees. She's on her way to being the most famous trance speaker in the country. And the newspaper article that you read for today, I think it gives you a sample of a one way she might sometimes do an evening lecture. Scott's audience would choose a panel, usually all men, from its members, and the panel would select the evening's topics for Cora Scott to address on the fly. They preferred what they thought of as masculine themes. So these were often topics in the sciences, which they thought were just beyond the educated woman unless she really had assistance from the spirit world. I want to take a closer look at that newspaper account. But before I do that, are there any questions?
The audience is just gaga over this particular story. I do want to take a moment to bring forward that question that I misplaced a little bit earlier. My apologies to Tanya in Boston. Professor, can you talk to us a little bit about the ways that higher education responded to this shift to pseudoscience, or the role of this in the emerging 20th century?
Oh gosh, that's a really rich question. I think that this is a time of real change in what it means to do science, and this is something that's changing in the realm of higher education as much as it is in the popular mind. So, if we take someone like the scientist I mentioned earlier, James Clerk Maxwell, who's this lion in the history of modern science. Einstein said that he stood on the shoulders of Maxwell. His career, it really marks a shift to focusing more on measurement and a kind of professionalization of lab space and a kind of higher sophistication in statistical analysis. You see a version of this story playing out too in the biological sciences, a little bit in Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution by natural selection, but especially in Darwin's successors in the later 19th century, who start to rely more and more on probability theory. And in order to make predictions and analysis at the level of populations, rather than making specific claims about individual cases. And the reason that these trends are important for this bigger picture we're considering is because they show us ways in which the practice of professional science was, by the second half of the 19th century, starting to grow a bit more distant from what we might call kind of lay common sense ideas of what science is, that science ought to consist of repeatable experiments, evidence that you can always see with your own eyes. And so these claims that are at the cutting edge of discoveries about human evolution, electricity, magnetism, they are, even in kind of the popularized form in which they are publicized in magazines and newspapers, they are perhaps growing less accessible to lay people. So I think we are, in that sense, in an interesting chapter in the story of Americans' complicated relationship with experts, and a way in which, in some charged political and cultural moments, they can really kind of rear up and reject the guidance of experts because the ivory tower is starting to become a bit more distant from
Yes.
What a traveling demonstration might show you.
Yeah, that's a fascinating access point. Thank you for addressing that. Well, we have about 15 minutes. Why don't we move to the conclusion of your formal presentation, and then we'll take the last questions.
Okay, great. So I just love this article that I gave you to read. This reporter is covering a performance that Cora Scott, or Cora Hatch, as she was then, did at a church in New York City. She was not quite 17 years old, although you might have noticed that one way the reporter kind of makes fun of the whole thing is to imply that she was much older than she claimed to be, to say that she's only been 17 for 3 or 4 years. But actually, I think she was still quite young, as much as he was mocking her. With students, I like to engage them in a really close reading of this article, and I ask them to look carefully at the description of her. The reporter notes the peculiar position of her hands as they lay most of the time on her bosom with a certain shrinking, nervous tremor in them. He says her hands gave an impression of a sorrowful submission to the powers that be. It's this very carefully crafted image of her femininity. I also like to draw their attention to the behavior of the committee. The reporter makes it seem at first like at least some of them are kind of having a laugh. And they deliberate and they come up with these questions. They ask her what principles of natural law govern the gyroscope, what causes the seeds of plants to germinate, did the various races now inhabiting the earth all spring from a common parent, and was Jesus of Nazareth of a divine or human origin? So this is one way these talks could open. As I said a few moments ago, on some occasions, she would stride into the lecture hall already in a trance. On this particular evening that we're reading about here, her husband escorted her on stage, and she sits down at a desk. She's staring up in this very sort of pious way at the church's dome ceiling, listening to these questions. She lowers her eyes, prays, and then she stands up and proceeds to give this response. And I've singled out on this next slide a part of the account that I like to drill down on with students, which is this direct quotation that he gives us of the more theological dimensions of her answer. And one of our audience members earlier asked about connections to Transcendentalism, and I think you really see that here. I won't read the whole thing, but she's talking about the voices of 10,000 souls speaking to us from eternity, this kind of sense of connecting with the silent depths of the spirits. It's not an Orthodox Christian narrative of fall and salvation in Jesus, right? She's saying that the great Adam of all nations, the great Christ himself informs of love and wisdom and intellect. So it's this lyrical, romantic transcendentalist mishmash of ideas that, I think the sort of poetry of it is really powerful, even if you kind of scrutinize it and think, what the heck is she really saying? There's a charisma here that I think is evident to us. And if you have students who've already done some of their work on 19th century religion with some knowledge of Transcendentalism and theosophy and these kinds of things, you can pick that up here. Now, spiritualists had a lot of critics, and I saw a question in the chat about fraud, and that's going to be something I pick up in a moment. But one line of criticism really focused on politics. Some critics claimed that mediums encouraged their followers to embrace radical anarchist politics, to abandon spouses, attend free love conventions, otherwise flout social mores. That term free love, it sounds more scandalous than I think it would strike us now. Really, these women simply opposed marriage laws that discriminated heavily against women and made it very hard for women to have any autonomy. Spiritualists argued that the rights that marriage gave men to have essentially constant access to their wives without their wives' consent made true love impossible. I've pulled up here a kind of laundry list of political causes that spiritualists connected. And I like to ask students to think about, why is it that spiritualists connected these things? Why did they link spiritualism with socialism and abolitionism, pacifism, non-resistance, vegetarianism, all of these things? I think they moved from rejecting mainstream, male-dominated, hierarchical authority in one sphere to another. And there's this powerful vision in spiritualist literature of working together with the immortal spirits in a giant virtuous army that fights on behalf of women and children and all oppressed people. Spiritualist conventions became places where women and men as well could talk about feminism. Several supporters of spiritualism attended the first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls in 1848. William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist, attended seances. He visited the Fox sisters. So we can start to see spiritualism as not just a wacky practice, not just a way to manage grief, but as really an entire worldview with this really optimistic view of humans who are all equal in some sense, who are on a path of eternal progression to the spirit world. And this isn't to say that, there aren't kind of some of the familiar racial dynamics and evidence of white supremacy that you see in any of these reform movements. But certainly if we're looking at the ideology, we see this egalitarian view that really posits spiritualists as being on the cutting edge of both science and humanitarian progress, who took some of those ideas and practices from earlier mesmerism, in which men were in charge, and kind of turned them on their head to build out this women's movement. Now, spiritualism came under quite heavy criticism in the 1850s, not just for politics, but for faking it. And a number of the most prominent mediums were exposed as frauds. You have this whole cottage industry of investigators who developed, people who devoted themselves to proving that this stuff was just parlor tricks. The Fox sisters fell in kind of hard times toward the end of their career, and in the 1880s, they accepted money from a reporter to explain how they did it. And they claim that they manufactured the knocking noises by cracking their toe joints. But even if some of these women were exposed as frauds, the scale of this movement is really significant. We know from the 1890 census, in which some people identify themselves by religious affiliation, that about 45,000 people nationally claimed this label spiritualist. But that's only those who were formally affiliated. Estimates, if we're trying to get our heads around how many people were kind of interested in these things and going to these events and seriously thinking about communicating with the spirit world, estimates range from a few 100,000 to 11 million. That's out of a population of about 25 million mid-century. Your reading lists some of the famous people of the 19th century who went to seances. So this is not a marginal thing. This is one way to gauge the significance of this movement, sheer numbers. Another reason is politics, which we've talked about. This is really a political movement that I think forces us to reckon with. The third point I like to make to students is that spiritualism shows us how the history of science and the history of religion are interwoven, and they ask the same questions. They're both interested in this mystery of invisible forces. And I think spiritualists help us see that in the 19th century, the boundaries between professional science and flashy entertainers and mystical religion, they're pretty fuzzy all around. They all have this they all orbit around this idea that there are important forces in the world that we cannot see, and that humans can learn about them and maybe even control them. They reflect this common preoccupation with, when do you trust your senses? When do you trust experts, or both, or neither? Spiritualists and Mesmerists were both quite focused on this question of direct witness testimony and evidence And then, we have to remember that when we're talking about spiritualists in the 19th century, sure, some features of it are very particular to that historical era. But even after spiritualism as a movement starts to wind down in the late 19th century, I don't think its basic impulses went away. And I don't know about you all, but I grew up playing with Ouija boards at sleepovers. It's totally mainstream. I saw a poll recently that something like 45% of Americans say they believe in ghosts. And there are so many, and this I saw coming up in the chat a little bit, there are so many non-traditional medical, spiritual, new age practices that mainstream doctors today totally dismiss. Reiki, an alternative medicine in which a practitioner manipulates a universal energy force. Qigong, also premised on this idea of an invisible energy. So many people claim that these practices work. And this is the last point it's crucial to make, and that is that spiritualism and its offshoots are not dead. This is not a historical relic. In Southern California, there is a medium named Carissa Schumacher who charges celebrities more than $1,000 an hour to channel the voice of Jesus Christ, whom she calls Yeshua. The New York Times Magazine did a great article about her last fall. And here's what Jennifer Aniston told that reporter about it. She said, "The Yeshua channeling thing is way out there." She goes on to say, "For some people, it's going to be insane, this idea of someone channeling Jesus. But it's more about this message she's tapped into. Everything she's communicated to me just resonates with me and excites me." I ran into this myself. I recently wrote a newspaper article about the booming world of spiritual coaches. And these are life coaches who specialize in kind of combining motivational speaking and pop psychology with this mishmash of new age spiritual practices. They are mostly women. Their clients are mostly women. A lot of them are trained as Reiki masters, or they use crystals. They sometimes draw on Christian ideas when it suits them. I went into that reporting project pretty skeptical of what they were doing, and then I got to know the stories of these women. Every woman I spoke to, was a cancer survivor, or the survivor of some horrible trauma, divorce, you name it. These are women who had been really let down by mainstream medicine, by their church, by romantic partners, by the sources of traditional authority. And you really kind of have to respect them as survivors, whatever you think of the metaphysics. They are kind of crafting their own tools to make sense of the chaos. So my point here is that these movements I've been talking about this evening, these are not ossified artifacts. They're part of a living tradition. People you know, people your students know, or your students themselves are involved in. Just today, I was lecturing about this to my students at University of North Carolina, and I had students come up to me after class saying that they, they consider themselves spiritualists. So teaching about them brings the past alive, and it helps us understand our own culture in a deeper way. And in the few minutes remaining, I'd love to take any remaining questions.
That's fantastic, Professor. Thank you. And I'll remind the audience that you can drop formal questions for Professor Worthen in the Ask the Professor tab, and we'll bring those forward in the few minutes we have left. I do have a couple of questions queued up at the moment. This first question comes from Adrian. Adrian's in Texas, and he's wondering if you can talk some about the role of capitalism in the 20th century. We've talked a lot tonight. I've seen in the audience chat comments on the Milton Bradley Ouija board, or the ways in which this was sold and commercialized, particularly in the 60s, 70s. I remember from as a kid as well. Talk to us a little bit about the role of making money on this process, even if it's not taken sincerely and earnestly.
Gosh, that's an enormously fruitful can of worms that I don't think I can do justice to in a few minutes. I mean, the short answer is absolutely the profit motive and the potential for profit is an enormous driver in this kind of burgeoning metaphysical, medical, scientific economy. I guess to make one short but I hope useful point, what is lurking behind this line of inquiry is the question of sincerity. And, is it the case that if an individual, a historical subject that we're studying with our students, is making money off of this practice, does that automatically mean, that they are a self-conscious charlatan, that they are willfully, pulling the wool over people's eyes, or even forget money? So often when we study religious practices, we see ways in which humans are adhering to a set of practices in order to gain power, worldly power that they don't yet have. And this is absolutely true of those populations that we consider oppressed minorities of various kinds. Or if we're studying a more privileged group, they seem to be adhering to a set of ideas that allow them to retain power. And so that's kind of a version of the money question. And I guess the point I often make to students is that all human motives are mixed, number one. Number two, humans are brilliant at coming to believe our own propaganda. And our understanding of the world, our efforts to make some order out of the entropy that is human existence, is premised on this kind of feedback loop between the ideas that we are imposing on the world, that we're offering to other people, that we're trying to instantiate in our community, and our material worldly experience. And they shape one another. So, did the guy who invented that ridiculous full body magnetic suit, did he believe that it worked and actually could help people? I would bet money that he did. I mean, the vast majority of these people are operating on the premise of something recognizable as self-belief. I think very few people persist knowingly in a lie. And so, this point about motive, I find it so important in teaching right now, because I don't know about you all, but my students are often so cynical. And they often think that the point of studying history is to kind of get behind the declarations in the text and suss out the secret motive, the kind of evil motive that is all about money or power. And to take that view of our historical subjects is just it's so limiting. It's so narrow. It does not do justice to the complexity of human existence.
That's a great point. Thank you so much. This question comes from Gary. Gary's in Virginia, and he wonders if there's any connection between this seeking of connection and being a medium to other understandings and the psychedelic era of the mid-20th century.
That's interesting. I mean, I think there are certainly broad echoes. And in this sort of general effort to connect with unseen forces, I guess I would be more inclined to trace the intellectual genealogy of some of the stuff that's happening in the 1960s to that engagement with Eastern religions, and that kind of that avenue of approach for seeking connection with unseen forces. But one of the points here is that humans throughout our history as a species, we're obsessed with control, right? Like we just want control over the chaos. And so you would be hard pressed to identify any cultural moment in any civilization where there isn't some preoccupation with uncovering the secret pathways by which we can wrest power over the hidden forces of the universe. That's just what we do as humans.
And that seems like a great place to conclude tonight's webinar with that point of how desperate we are as humans to control that chaos. And we very much appreciate you walking us through the story and providing such interesting ways to connect us with the students we teach. Professor, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. This was super fun.
I want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us tonight for the webinar. I do hope that you follow our social media and our email listserv to see upcoming opportunities and activities that we have available. That does include our next webinar. I'll be joined on September 27th, so 1 week from tonight, by Ann Blaschke. She's an associate lecturer in American Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and we'll be discussing Title IX at 50. Hey, everybody, thanks so much for joining us. Have a wonderful day at school tomorrow. Have a good week, and I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you for spending the evening with us.